The date was November 30th, 1943. The location, Tehran, Iran. Deep in the basement of the Soviet embassy, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov found himself at a crossroads between truth and deception. His hand hesitated above the operational report spread before him, pen frozen mid-signature. The words he was about to write could never see the light of day in any official Soviet document. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Outside the embassy windows, the rumble of Studebaker engines echoed through Tehran's streets. American-built trucks carried Soviet supplies destined for the conference where Stalin would soon meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that moment, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander came face to face with a reality that would remain locked away in classified vaults for nearly half a century. The Red Army pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin wasn't marching on Soviet muscle alone. It rolled on American trucks, burned American fuel, ate American food. Stalin himself would later acknowledge this truth, though only in whispered toasts among the inner circle. The numbers painted a stark picture. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps would cross the Arctic convoys, travel the Persian corridor, and arrive via the Pacific route into Soviet hands. More vehicles than the Soviet Union manufactured during the entire war. More trucks than most nations possessed altogether. These machines would convert the Red Army from a force moving at the pace of marching men and horse-drawn supply lines into a mechanized powerhouse capable of sustaining massive operations across thousand-mile fronts. What the Soviet officers present in Tehran couldn't imagine was that their private conversations were being meticulously recorded, not just by American stenographers, but by their own NKVD agents as well. These secret transcripts would eventually contradict decades of Soviet propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. The story of Soviet transportation problems began with catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, when 3.8 million Axis soldiers crashed across the Soviet frontier in Operation Barbarossa, they discovered a Red Army dangerously unprepared for mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, approximately 700,000 vehicles strong, consisted mainly of the Gaz-AA, a Soviet copy of the 1934 American Ford model, and the ZIS-5, which borrowed heavily from 1920s American designs. Within 6 months, 40% of this fleet lay destroyed or captured. The statistics revealed an industrial weakness that Soviet propaganda would spend decades concealing. In 1941 alone, the Soviet Union produced just 176 trucks, while losing nearly 300,000. The Gorky Automotive Factory, the nation's primary truck manufacturing center, had to evacuate eastward as German forces pressed closer, reducing production to a trickle. The ZS factory in Moscow shifted entirely to tank production as German armies approached the city's gates. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies traveled on foot while their artillery relied on horse-drawn transport, when horses could be found at all. The Second Shock Army, trapped in the Volkhov Pocket, lost 95% of its transport attempting to break out. Soldiers carried artillery shells on their backs for guns they could no longer move. This was the army that American aid would ultimately transform, though it would take Soviet leaders 4 decades to publicly admit it. German mechanized spearheads had proven what modern warfare demanded: mobility, speed, and reliable logistics. Soviet forces, despite numerical superiority in many areas, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered and encircled because they couldn't match German mobility. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized were marching on foot. Artillery batteries requiring prime movers relied on horses that died by the thousands in the brutal Russian winter. October 1st, 1941. The Arctic port of Arkhangelsk lay shrouded in the frozen darkness of autumn. British convoy PQ-1 unloaded its cargo into this desolate landscape. 20 American trucks rolled onto Soviet soil, the first wave of what would become an enormous tide. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed cabs and dependable engines, appeared like miracles to Soviet drivers accustomed to vehicles requiring hours of maintenance for every hour of actual operation. By November 1941, when German forces stood just 12 miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were arriving at a rate of 2,000 per month through multiple supply routes. The Persian Corridor, administered by American engineers who had taken control of Iran's state railway, increased its capacity by 600%. The Pacific route, restricted to non-military supplies due to Soviet-Japanese neutrality, still moved thousands of vehicles. The dangerous Arctic convoys, suffering heavy losses to U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks, persisted in delivering precious cargo. The vehicles themselves represented a technological leap that stunned Soviet mechanics. The Studebaker US-6 featured six-wheel drive, all six wheels powered, compared to Soviet trucks with only four wheels and just two powered. The engine generated 94 horsepower against the ZIS-5's 73. Most importantly, American trucks came equipped with self-recovery winches, allowing them to pull themselves free from mud that would trap Soviet vehicles until spring thaw. These machines arrived fully equipped with tools Soviet forces had never encountered. Complete 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks, tire repair equipment, spare parts catalogs with numbered components. A Soviet truck came with basic hand tools if it came with any tools at all. Americans had anticipated everything: cold weather starting equipment, cabin heaters that actually functioned, sealed electrical systems that wouldn't short in wet conditions. Soviet trucks had mechanical brakes that failed when wet, cast iron pistons, settling tanks that rarely worked properly, and engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. The Tehran Conference, held from November 28 through December 1, 1943, produced one of history's most extraordinary Soviet admissions, though it would remain classified in American archives until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November 30th, attended only by Roosevelt, Churchill, and their closest advisors, Stalin stood for a toast that directly contradicted everything Soviet propaganda would claim for the next 50 years. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin declared, "I want to tell you what. From the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin had specifically highlighted trucks during the technical discussions that followed. The Soviet leader called American Studebakers the best trucks in the world for our conditions and described them as the foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet just 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly declare that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary, representing only about 10% of Soviet production. This falsehood became Soviet orthodoxy, enforced by censors and historians who knew the truth but valued their careers and lives over historical accuracy. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov told American logistics officers, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us." This from a military leader who publicly credited only Soviet industry with victory. To understand why American trucks proved so decisive, one must examine Soviet logistics mathematics. A single Soviet rifle division on offense required 450 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies. On defense, it needed 300 tons. A tank corps required 1,000 tons. Moving these supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's primitive road network demanded trucks. Major General Andrei Krylev, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report revealed the stark reality. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for offensive operations. Soviet production from January through September 1943 totaled just 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries in the same period: 94,000 vehicles. Without American vehicles, Soviet forces couldn't operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines. The qualitative difference mattered as much as quantity. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZIS-5 and Gaz-AA, had cargo ratings of 2.5 to 3 tons, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on front roads without breaking down. American Studebaker USS, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely carried 5 tons on good roads and 3 tons across country terrain. Their mean time between failures was 10,000 kilometers, compared to 2,000 for Soviet trucks. The mechanical advantages extended beyond mere reliability. American trucks featured innovations Soviet designers hadn't conceived. Air brakes that worked in any weather, aluminum pistons that reduced engine weight, oil filters that actually filtered, thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperature. Soviet trucks had mechanical brakes that failed when wet, cast-iron pistons, settling tanks that rarely functioned, engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. While Arctic convoys captured public imagination with their desperate battles against submarines, the Persian Corridor quietly became the primary delivery route for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border represented one of military history's greatest logistical achievements. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure in mere months. They inherited a single-track railway, moving 200 tons daily, and increased capacity to 6,000 tons. They built highways where only camel paths existed. They constructed assembly plants in the desert, capable of processing 300 trucks daily. The truck assembly plant at Andimeshk became the symbol of American industrial power, transplanted to the Middle East. Soviet drivers would arrive after grueling journeys from the Caucasus, receive 3 days of training on American vehicles, then drive their new trucks 1,800 miles back to the front. The cultural shock ran deep. Soviet soldiers accustomed to vehicles requiring constant repair suddenly commanded machines that simply worked. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was delivering thousands of trucks monthly. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled 50,000 tons annually before the war, processed 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency astonished Soviet liaison officers who reported to Moscow about dock operations unloading ships in 48 hours, tasks requiring 2 weeks at Soviet ports. The total vehicles delivered through this route reached into the tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting nearly half of all American trucks reached the Soviet Union via Iran. The marriage of American trucks to Soviet rocket artillery created one of World War II's most feared weapons. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on ZAS-6 trucks, but production of this vehicle ceased in late 1941. The handful of rail-mounted and towed versions proved nearly useless in mobile warfare. The Studebaker US-6 transformed everything. Its reinforced chassis could handle the violent recoil of a full rocket salvo. Its 6-wheel drive allowed it to fire and relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived. The cross-country performance of the Studebaker was so superior that it became the standardized mount in 1943, designated BM-13N. More than 1,800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by war's end. Guards formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates 400% higher than those using Soviet vehicles. The ability to shoot and scoot, fire a salvo, and relocate within 3 minutes depended entirely on reliable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they worked at all, needed 15 minutes for the same maneuver. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. German soldiers called them Stalin's organs, but noted they rode on American trucks. Examining production statistics reveals the mathematical impossibility of Soviet victory without American trucks. Soviet vehicle production during the war totaled approximately 1941, 46,100 vehicles, 1942, 32,300 vehicles, 1943, 41,600 vehicles, 1944, 57,400 vehicles, 1945, 27,600 vehicles through May. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units, less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this, losses were catastrophic. Nearly 300,000 vehicles in 1941 alone, with continued losses throughout the war totaling over 500,000 vehicles. Without American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle pool would have ceased to exist by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad depended on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles comprised 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet, but represented 70% of its actual transport capacity due to their superior carrying capacity and reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US-6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them free through Lend-Lease. Producing equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union approximately $800 million, resources desperately needed for tank and aircraft production, plus industrial capacity the USSR simply didn't possess. Operation Bagration, launched June 23, 1944, demonstrated definitively that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which destroyed German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been impossible without American vehicles. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning exposed the mathematical dependency. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Soviet railways could deliver to depots 60 to 100 kilometers behind the lines. From there, only trucks could maintain the advance. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of them American. The speed of advance, 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, overwhelmed German planning, which assumed Soviet forces would need operational pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild logistics. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive capability based on Soviet truck production. Not knowing American vehicles had tripled Red Army transport capacity. During Bagration's 5 weeks, American trucks in Soviet service carried 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself delivered largely by other American trucks. Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained the offensive for 1 week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark. The failed Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 had stalled partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within days. By 1944, with American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks, transforming tactical victories into strategic triumphs. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left 3 separate testimonies about American aid that remained hidden until the Soviet collapse. Each added details that demolished the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware of hidden microphones, Zhukov stated, "People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came from interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966, tape recordings that remained suppressed until 1990. Zhukov was explicit. Without American Studebakers, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport. The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript seized in 1969 and locked in archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells in 2 weeks, possible only with American vehicles making continuous supply runs. Khrushchev wanted to share what he truly believed about Stalin's thinking on a fundamental question. Could the Soviet Union have defeated Nazi Germany without help from America and Britain? The answer, he said plainly, was no. If the Americans hadn't stepped in with support, the Soviet war effort would have collapsed. A one-on-one fight against the Germans? Impossible. The Red Army couldn't have withstood the pressure. Defeat would have been inevitable. Trucks were the real story that nobody discussed publicly. Stalin never put his thoughts on paper about this, at least not that anyone found, but he told Khrushchev directly multiple times in private conversations. The losses would have been catastrophic. Without the ability to move supplies and troops flexibly across vast distances, the whole operation would have ground to a halt. Yet this same Khrushchev, Years later, a Soviet premier stood before the world and declared that the Soviet Union had won through its own strength alone. It was a contradiction that captured something deeply broken in the Soviet system, a kind of national schizophrenia about acknowledging help from the West. The Soviet mechanics who kept American trucks running understood the gap between American and Soviet engineering better than anyone. They saw it every single day. American engines used aluminum pistons. Soviet engines relied on heavy cast iron. American trucks had oil filters for protection. Soviet trucks used settling tanks instead. The American vehicles had sealed wheel bearings that could last 50,000 kilometers. Soviet bearings, if you were lucky, managed 5,000. And the parts system. Soviet mechanics marveled at it. The Americans sent catalogs showing every component with identification numbers. You looked up what you needed, ordered by number, and the exact part arrived. The Soviet system was completely different. Mechanics had to cannibalize broken vehicles or fabricate parts by hand. American trucks came equipped with safety features that seemed revolutionary. Mirrors on both sides, backup lights, horns that worked with one hand. Soviet designers had simply never thought about such things. Beyond the immediate military value, these American machines rewrote how Soviets thought about automotive engineering. Soviet engineers studying the Studebakers and other American vehicles absorbed lessons that shaped Soviet truck design for decades afterward. The ZIS 150, the first major Soviet truck produced after the war, was essentially an adaptation of American design principles. More than just the vehicles themselves, American trucks brought a maintenance culture that barely existed in Soviet practice before. Preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, parts standardization. These concepts came directly from watching how American vehicles operated, and they influenced Soviet industrial thinking for a generation. The Winter War 4 years earlier had exposed something terrifying. In 1939 and 1940, Soviet forces couldn't even supply troops stationed just 150 kilometers from Leningrad. Against the Finns, who were outnumbered 10-1, the Red Army suffered 126,875 dead and 264,908 wounded. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's analysis afterward pointed to one critical failure: trucks. Soviet forces had the numbers, but couldn't concentrate them or move them where needed. Transportation was the bottleneck. By 1944, everything had changed. American vehicles solved the problems that had crippled operations against the Finns. When Soviet forces struck Finnish positions in June 1944, they succeeded partly because American vehicles could maintain supply lines through terrain that had defeated Soviet logistics just a few years before. Soviet propaganda always emphasized railways as the real backbone of logistics, which meant downplaying how much the trucks mattered. Declassified military documents told a different story. The Germans had destroyed 65,000 kilometers of track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations during their retreat. Soviet railway troops could restore about 20 kilometers daily in combat conditions, but restored single-track lines could only handle 6 to 8 trains daily compared to 40 or 50 on intact double-track routes. The real problem? Railways ended somewhere. The final 50 to 100 kilometers to where fighting actually happened required trucks. No trucks meant supplies never reached the front lines. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way. They had excellent railway engineers who kept pace at first, but without enough trucks, supplies piled up uselessly at railway stations, while combat units ran out of ammunition. The Studebakers captured Soviet attention, but the full range of American vehicles mattered equally. 51,503 Willys Jeeps revolutionized reconnaissance and command. They allowed officers to maintain real-time control. Commanders could visit multiple divisions in a single day, making decisions faster than ever possible before. 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided tactical mobility for infantry squads. 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as divisional workhorses. Marshal Ivan Konev noted how Jeeps accelerated the command cycle itself, giving Soviet forces a decisive edge in coordinating complex operations. The campaign to erase this history started even before the war ended. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order Number 7572. All photographs showing foreign equipment were to be censored. Soviet industry alone would receive credit for victory. What followed was a 40-year erasure from Soviet memory. Photographs were doctored, American vehicles painted over and replaced with Soviet equipment. Films showing American trucks were edited or destroyed. When veterans tried to write memoirs about their experiences, censors systematically removed any mention of foreign aid. Studebaker became truck. American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages disappeared or were rewritten. The suppression extended to how the numbers were presented. By 1960, Soviet history claimed Lend-Lease represented only 4% of Soviet wartime production. The math worked only if you counted everything, civilian goods too, and used currency values that made American equipment appear less valuable than it actually was. When veterans submitted memoirs describing American trucks, editors replaced specific references with vague language. The official story had to remain pure. As Cold War tensions grew hotter, the suppression intensified further. Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky issued reports in 1948 claiming Lend-Lease was merely 4% of production, while simultaneously denouncing America as the leader of an anti-democratic camp. That became the official line for 4 decades. Soviet historians faced an impossible choice: repeat lies or destroy their careers. Most chose security, writing histories that credited Soviet industrial strength alone with defeating Hitler. Soviet children grew up learning that their nation had defeated Hitler essentially by itself. Museums displayed captured German equipment but hid American vehicles. War memorials celebrated Soviet tanks but never mentioned the trucks that carried ammunition to the front lines. The historical memory was stolen from an entire population. Only when Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost could honest discussion finally happen. In 1989, a military history journal published transcripts from the Tehran conference showing Stalin's own admission. The reaction shocked everyone. Readers discovered their entire understanding of the war rested on lies. Veterans finally spoke truthfully about what they'd witnessed. At a 1990 reunion in Moscow, former truck drivers stood up and testified about their American vehicles, stories that had been hidden for 45 years. What researchers found in newly opened archives was stunning. Dual bookkeeping existed, real statistics for internal planning, false ones for public consumption. The actual numbers showed American trucks comprised 70% of Soviet transport capacity by 1945. Dr. Boris Sokolov, examining declassified archives, calculated it precisely. Remove American trucks from the Red Army and every single offensive after Stalingrad fails. The Red Army essentially marched to Berlin in American trucks. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 demonstrated this most vividly. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers needed supplies. 41,600 artillery pieces needed ammunition and fuel. All of it had to move across destroyed German territory. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front alone required 25,000 tons of supplies every single day. His logistics network included 22,000 trucks total, of which 16,000 were American. The ammunition consumption in just the first week was 2.5 million artillery shells. That required trucks making continuous runs under fire. Each American truck averaged 4 supply runs daily, 100 kilometers round trip. Soviet trucks, when they worked at all, might manage 1 run before breaking down. The dependency was absolute. The victory parade through Berlin was accomplished with American vehicles. The most dependable, the most presentable, Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital while riding Roosevelt's trucks. The full accounting of American aid after the Soviet Union collapsed revealed the true scope: 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,303 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, 2,328 ordnance service vehicles, supporting materials totaled 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives. 11,775 railroad cars. Just the vehicle deliveries alone represented more trucks than Germany manufactured during the entire war. Enough transport to completely motorize 60 rifle divisions. By the war's end, American vehicles had transported 60% of all ammunition. They had moved 70% of all fuel. They evacuated 65% of wounded. They towed 58% of artillery pieces. After the war, grateful Soviet officials proposed memorials to American aid. Marshal Zhukov suggested a monument to the Allied arsenal of democracy. The Communist Party rejected every proposal. For 45 years, no monument acknowledged American trucks' contribution. Only in 2004 was a modest Lend-Lease memorial finally unveiled in Murmansk. Even then, controversy erupted. The absence of monuments reflected a deeper tragedy: the theft of historical memory. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation alone had defeated Hitler. As the last veterans aged, their testimonies became precious historical documents. At a 2005 gathering in Moscow, remaining drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood to preserve true history. They collected photographs hidden for 60 years, showing American vehicles with Soviet markings. Their final statement, signed by 200 veterans, declared something simple and profound. We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. This doesn't diminish what we sacrificed. 27 million of our people died. But truth honors their memory better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland. Today, Russia revises World War II history again for political purposes. Modern Russian textbooks minimize American aid even more than Soviet ones did, part of a campaign to restore national pride through historical mythology. Yet the mathematical facts cannot be changed. 427,284 American vehicles were documented as delivered, more than double what the Soviet Union produced during the entire war. 205,000 Soviet-made trucks against 427,000 American vehicles. The testimony of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov survives in multiple archives. It cannot be denied. The story of American trucks carries renewed meaning. International cooperation, not isolation, defeated fascism. These vehicles were products of democracy's productive might, shared freely with an ally despite ideological differences. The story transcends military logistics. It demonstrates how industrial capacity determines modern wars, how ideology distorts history, and how truth persists despite suppression. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps represented the margin between victory and defeat. They transformed the Red Army from a World War I-style force dependent on railways and horses into a mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across continental distances. Soviet leaders understood this. Stalin admitted at Tehran that without American machines, the war would have been lost. Zhukov confessed that without American trucks, Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull artillery with. Khrushchev acknowledged that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure. Yet for 45 years, the system maintained false narratives. Photos were doctored, memoirs were censored, statistics were manipulated. The Communist Party stole from its own people the true history of their victory, replacing it with mythology that served politics but betrayed historical truth. Only Glasnost brought the full truth from archives, recordings, and testimonies. The evidence proved that American trucks weren't merely helpful, they were essential. The Studebakers that Soviet soldiers called Zakodny, meaning go anywhere, were as vital to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial. The suppression and eventual revelation carries lessons beyond military history. It shows how authoritarian regimes manipulate memory, how political necessities override accuracy, and how truth ultimately emerges despite official suppression. The mathematical fact remains unchanged. Soviet forces rode to Berlin in American trucks. The arsenal of democracy defeated the Wehrmacht not just with weapons, but with wheels. 427,284 of them crossing oceans and continents to carry the Red Army to victory. Those trucks symbolize more than machinery. They represent how industrial democracy's productive capacity, shared freely with ideological opponents, proved decisive in humanity's struggle against fascism. The Soviet generals who admitted they would have lost without American trucks spoke truth transcending politics. Modern wars are won not by courage alone, but by the marriage of bravery and industrial might. The sturdy Studebakers that survived decades in Soviet service outlasted the lies told about them. Veterans knew it, documents proved it, history recorded it. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory. The wheels of the arsenal of democracy carried not just supplies, but the hopes of nations to triumph over tyranny. The final irony is that American generosity created the very Soviet power that spent 45 years denying American contribution. Yet truth, like those reliable American engines, endures beyond political manipulation. Soviet generals were right. They would have lost without 400,000 American trucks. The machinery of democracy delivered freedom to those who would later deny its help. Yet the engine still ran. History still speaks.